We've learned how the idea of white privilege started, but we should also be thinking in terms of how it's perpetuated. When we speak in terms of the possessive investment in whiteness, we're referring to the systemic efforts to create white advantage. These efforts can be conscious or unconscious. The most obvious example of white advantage relative to labor is the institution of slavery. The idea of slavery was supported by the idea that Africans were racially inferior and that all the traits that were different from the Anglo-Saxon characteristics were also inferior. Even though slavery was outlawed, the distinction of better characteristics associated with white Anglo-Saxon heritage were maintained. This idea of being better is embodied in the general ideologies about whiteness. Another type of policy that created systemic advantages for whites was the Federal Housing Act of 1934, known to some as the FHA, where loans were made mostly to white families to buy houses in racially segregated neighborhoods. The policy of discriminatory lending practices, known as redlining, assured that it would be easier for whites to buy homes and that blacks or African Americans would have to pay higher interest rates, if indeed they could even get a loan. Urban renewal projects cleared out what was designated as slum areas, forcing African Americans to be displaced and tearing apart their communities. Policies that might look race-neutral in their application have in reality consequences that further disadvantage minority groups. Now think about the idea of color blindness, which is based on the idea that you don't see color and that whites are justified in treating minority groups the same way as if they are equals, and justifies ignoring past racism and disadvantage. Colorblindness calls for the elimination of policies to remedy past harms. There are 4 kinds of colorblindness: abstract liberalism, naturalization, cultural racism, and minimalism of racism. We've talked a little bit about redlining already. Let's go a little deeper into understanding the practice. Redlining typically involves lenders that refuse to lend money or extend credit to borrowers in certain areas of town. Those areas are often occupied by people in poverty, people of color, or both. Now, it's against the law to discriminate against borrowers based on race or color. Redlining, though, it got its name because lenders would literally draw a red line around a neighborhood on a map, often targeting areas with a high concentration of people of color, and then refused to lend in those areas because they considered it high risk. Even though redlining is now against the law, major lenders today still end up in court over this despicable practice. Even though the Fair Housing Act forbids discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, handicap, or familial status, discrimination still exists. It is also against the federal law for real estate agents to steer clients to particular neighborhoods, whether deliberately by the agent or at the buyer's personal request. It means if a buyer says, "I want to buy a home in XYZ neighborhood," an agent still can't direct a buyer to a neighborhood made up of a high-density population of XYZ. White supremacy, on the other hand, is based on the idea that whites are superior to other races. The roots of U.S. racism, or white supremacy, lie in the establishment of economic exploitation by the theft of resources and human labor, and then justifying that exploitation by institutionalizing the inferiority of its victims. The first application of white supremacy or racism by the European Americans who control U.S. society was against the indigenous peoples. Then came blacks, originally as slaves, and later as exploited waged labor. They were followed by Mexicans, who lost their means of survival when they lost their land holdings and also became wage slaves. Recall now that Mexican labor built the Southwest, along with the Chinese, the Filipinos, the Japanese, and other workers. White nationalist groups espouse white supremacist or white separatist ideologies, often focusing on the alleged inferiority of non-whites. Groups listed in a variety of other categories, the Ku Klux Klan, the Neo-Confederate, the Neo-Nazis, racist skinhead, and Christian identity, could also be fairly described as white nationalist. White nationalist groups believe that white identity should be the organizing principle of the countries that make up the Western civilization. White nationalists advocate for policies to reverse changing demographics and the loss of an absolute white majority. Ending non-white immigration, both illegal and illegal, is an urgent priority, frequently elevated over other racist projects.